The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above Cedar Creek Medical's ICU, a sound Katie Rodriguez had learned to filter out years ago. She moved through the ward at 5:27 a.m., before most of the day's shift arrived, her movements economical and silent, the kind of efficiency that made people wonder if she'd actually been in a room at all. Her scrubs were navy, nondescript, the pockets weighted with a penlight, trauma shears, and a faded unit patch she touched each morning before rounds, a ghost from Fallujah she never spoke about. The patch was sewn inside her white coat's lining, hidden where no one would think to look, where no one would ever know it was there. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. She simply moved through the corridor like someone who'd learned long ago how to occupy space without demanding attention. Room 347 held Colonel James Barkley, the paralyzed Marine from Baghdad who'd been under her care for 3 weeks now. He'd taken an IED blast that severed his spinal cord at T4, and the neurological damage had left everything below his chest a landscape of sensation he could feel but not control. His daughter Rebecca sat in the bedside chair, head tilted against the wall in that particular angle of exhausted vigil that Katie recognized immediately. She'd seen it in hospital corridors in Fallujah, in the faces of mothers and wives and sisters waiting for the body to do what the doctor said it couldn't. Katie's son Miguel had served under Colonel Barkley for 14 months in Helmand Province, though she'd never mentioned that fact to anyone. Some things were buried too deep to unearth. Katie approached the bed with her hand steady and her eyes on the monitor display. Barkley's vital signs climbed across the screen like a reassuring heartbeat: blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 97%, heart rate 64. She'd learned to read vital signs the way other people read faces, each number a word in a story about suffering and recovery. She checked the 4-line running into his left arm, the fluid level in the bag, the integrity of the connection. No tremor in her hands. No hesitation in her movements. Just the precision of someone who'd threaded arterial lines in forward operating bases while incoming fire rattled the tents around her, muscle memory encoded so deeply it felt like breathing. "Morning, Colonel," she said quietly, her voice pitched low so as not to wake Rebecca. "How's the pain this morning?" Barkley's eyes tracked toward her, grey and steady. "Manageable. The pump's working." Katie nodded, making a note on his chart. She adjusted the angle of his bed slightly, a millimeter at a time, watching his face for any micro-expression that indicated discomfort. This was the work that made Dr. Pierce's skin crawl, though he wouldn't arrive at Cedar Creek for another hour. He'd watched her for 3 weeks, observing how she moved around patients with an almost surgical precision, how staff members asked her opinion before asking his, how even the attending physicians occasionally deferred to her judgment about patient comfort and medication timing. He saw competence. He didn't see the way she never missed a detail, the muscle memory that came from somewhere darker than any nursing school could teach. He didn't see the faded scar tissue on her forearms, which she'd misread as the deliberate markings of someone damaged, rather than the shrapnel wounds of someone who'd survived things he could barely imagine. He saw only a threat to his carefully constructed hierarchy. Rebecca stirred in her chair, eyes opening slowly. Katie placed a fresh cup of water on the bedside table, ice already chilled the way she preferred it. "You're up early," Rebecca said, voice rough from sleep. "Always am," Katie replied. "Better to get ahead of the day." She checked the catheter, noting the output, the color, the drainage. Each observation was recorded. Each measurement was precise. This was the language Katie spoke fluently, the language of data and observation, of physical response and chemical reaction. She'd spoken it in field hospitals in Anbar Province, in forward aid stations where resources were scarce and triage decisions meant someone lived and someone didn't. That language didn't require words. It required only attention. By 6:15 a.m., other nurses began arriving on the unit, filtering through the corridors in clusters of 2 and 3. Katie had already completed vital signs on 5 patients, updated 3 charts, and coordinated with the night shift about medication changes and pending test results. When Jen from the night shift passed her at the supply cart, she squeezed Katie's shoulder briefly. "He had a rough night," Jen said, meaning Barkley. "Kept asking about his daughter. Wouldn't sleep." "I'll adjust the comfort protocols," Katie said. Might help him rest. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a competent assessment followed by a decisive action plan, and Jen simply nodded and moved on. That was the rhythm of Cedar Creek's ICU when Katie was working, a kind of choreographed efficiency that happened around her like water flowing around stone. The other nurses on the unit, the ones who'd worked alongside her for 3 weeks, had learned to trust her judgment completely. They asked her first. They listened when she spoke. They deferred to her assessment of patients, not because she demanded it, but because she was never wrong. Dr. Pierce arrived at 6:56 a.m., his cologne arriving 30 seconds before his physical body did. He carried a fresh coffee from the Starbucks across the street, a $7 cappuccino that he'd have someone else charge to the hospital cafeteria, and wore his white coat like armor. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that had probably served him well in medical school interviews, and his hair was precisely groomed in the style of someone who'd never faced a day he couldn't pay his way out of. He moved through the unit with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in a room, and his eyes immediately settled on Katie, who was now explaining to Rebecca the importance of repositioning Colonel Barkley every 2 hours to prevent pressure ulcers. Katie's voice was quiet. Respectful. The voice of someone accustomed to explaining herself to people in authority. Turning him regularly maintained skin integrity, she was saying. I can show you the protocol if you'd like. Rebecca nodded, absorbing the information, and Katie began to demonstrate the proper way to support his upper body, the angle of his hip, the importance of keeping his weight distributed evenly. Her hands were steady. Her movements were precise. Her knowledge was evident in every gesture, in the way she'd clearly done this thousands of times, in the way she moved with the confidence of someone who'd kept people alive in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital room. Dr. Pierce watched this from the nursing station, his jaw tightening slightly. He set his coffee cup down on the desk with a soft click, the only sound he allowed himself to make. Watching Katie move through the room with that kind of quiet authority, that kind of embodied expertise, triggered something in him that he'd spent considerable effort denying. He'd attended Johns Hopkins. He'd done his residency at Duke. His family had donated a new wing to Mount Sinai 3 years ago. And yet here was a nurse, not a doctor, not a physician with credentials and pedigree and the kind of background that appeared in alumni publications, moving through his unit with a competence that made his presence feel somehow diminished by comparison. He didn't like the feeling. He'd never liked the feeling. And over the course of the last 3 weeks, he'd begun to notice small things. The way nurses gravitated toward Katie's station instead of his. The way families seemed to trust her explanations more readily than his own clinical updates. The way his authority, which should have been absolute, seemed somehow supplementary when she was present. It was a structural problem, he told himself. A hierarchy issue. Someone needed to recalibrate the pecking order of the ICU, and he was precisely the person to do it. Katie finished adjusting Barkley's position and stepped back from the bed. The Colonel's eyes met hers for just a moment, and there was a flicker of something in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, or something even deeper that 2 people carried when they'd both survived things they could never adequately explain. Rebecca reached over and squeezed Katie's hand briefly. "Thank you," she said. "You're so good with him." Katie nodded once, already moving on. She didn't accept compliments easily. Compliments drew attention, and attention was something she'd learned long ago to avoid. Her job was to keep Colonel Barkley stable, to manage his pain, to monitor his recovery with the kind of meticulous attention that meant the difference between healing and decline. Everything else, the recognition, the gratitude, the quiet admiration she garnered from staff and families alike, was secondary to the work itself. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Pierce watched her move to the medication cart, watched her verify a drug order with the pharmacist on the phone, watched her explain the rationale for an adjustment to Barkley's pain medication with a clarity and confidence that made the pharmacist immediately agree with her assessment. And in that moment, something shifted in his mind. He wasn't thinking about patient care anymore. He was thinking about hierarchy. He was thinking about credentials and pedigree and the proper order of things. He was thinking about how a nurse without the right background, without the right connections, without the right kind of family name had somehow positioned herself as an authority in his unit. That was going to change. Not immediately. Not obviously. But it was going to change. Katie finished her rounds at 8:27 a.m. and took her break in the staff lounge, where she sat alone with a cup of black coffee and her phone dark on the table in front of her. The patch was there, inside her coat, waiting to be touched. But she wouldn't touch it. Not during daylight. Not where anyone might see. She simply sat very still, the way she'd learned to do in places where stillness meant survival, and waited for the shift to continue. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she'd learned long ago. And she had seen the worst. She was still seeing it every time she looked at Colonel Barclay's paralyzed form and understood exactly what he'd lost, exactly what it meant to be a warrior trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed commands. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent light hum when Dr. Pierce walked in. Katie sat alone at the corner table, her lunch container open, a single measured bite on her fork. She didn't look up. "I'm just saying," he announced to the room, loud enough to carry. "Some nurses think watching a few YouTube videos makes them qualified to second-guess doctors with actual medical degrees." His voice had the texture of a man used to being listened to. Smooth. Polished. Dangerous. He pulled out a chair at the adjacent table, settling in like he'd just joined a conversation that mattered. Two nurses at the nearest table, Jennifer and Marcus, exchanged glances. They gathered their containers. Their napkins. They left. Katie took one measured breath. Wiped her mouth with precision. Said nothing. The silence in the room shifted. Changed texture. 3 other nurses remained, but their conversations died mid-word. They weren't reading their phones, they were watching. Waiting to see if she would respond. When she didn't, when she simply continued her lunch with the calm of someone eating alone by choice, something worse happened than if she'd fought back. Dr. Pierce smiled. He came back the next day. And the day after. Medication adjustments require physician authorization, obviously, he said to the room on Wednesday, stirring his coffee with one finger pointed at the word obviously. Some staff members still don't grasp that hierarchy. His eyes never landed on Katie. That was the cruelest part. She was beneath acknowledgement. The isolation came faster than she expected. On Monday, when Katie sat in the break room, Jennifer and 3 others were eating together. By Tuesday, Jennifer's shift had moved to nights. By Wednesday, the group scattered before Katie reached the table. By Thursday, no one sat near her at all. Conversations resumed only after she left. The pattern was so efficient, so perfectly orchestrated, that Katie realized Dr. Pierce hadn't needed to orchestrate anything. He'd simply given permission for what people already wanted, distance from a woman who made them uncomfortable with her competence. Susan Chen, the unit director, pulled Katie aside on Thursday evening as she was finishing her rounds. The hallway was empty. The ventilator down the corridor wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and impersonal. Dr. Pierce mentioned some judgment errors, Susan said, her voice apologetic in a way that meant she didn't believe the words but had to repeat them anyway. His documented concerns. "I need you to be more careful." Katie felt her right hand move to her coat, the lining where the patch was sewn, where her fingers knew exactly where to find it. The fabric was worn smooth by 14 years of touch. "What specific errors?" Katie's voice came out level. "Professional. I'd like to review them." "Just be careful, Katie." Susan wouldn't meet her eyes. "Just be careful." The public destruction happened on Friday morning. Colonel Barclay's room had become a landscape of medical machinery and quiet trauma. His daughter Rachel sat in the chair beside his bed, reading aloud from a novel neither of them would finish. Barclay's paralyzed form lay still, his eyes the only part of him that could still track the world. His pneumothorax risk was elevated, his paralysis meant shallow breathing, meant his lungs weren't expanding with the force they needed, meant every medication adjustment was a calculation that could save him or kill him. Katie had adjusted his pain protocol at 0600 hours. A reduction in the morphine dosage. An increase in the non-opioid agents. His original prescription would have put him in respiratory suppression, his already compromised lungs wouldn't have survived it. She documented the change, signed her name, waited for the attending to review. Dr. Pierce reviewed it at 0745 hours. He printed it out. He walked to Barclay's room. And he made his choice. "Miss Rodriguez," he said loudly, emphasizing the miss the way a man emphasizes words when he wants witnesses to remember them. "Would you like to explain to this family why you think you're qualified to override my orders?" Rachel looked up from her book. Her face went pale. "Do you have an MD I'm not aware of?" His voice was calm. Reasonable. The voice of a man asking a simple question. "Or do you just think the rules don't apply to you?" He was standing close enough that Rachel could see his shoulder. Close enough that Colonel Barclay's breathing increased, his monitor registering the stress. Beep. 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 Faster. Katie felt the moment arrive before she saw it. The singular instant where she could respond or refuse to respond, fight back or accept the blow. She'd survived worse than this man. She'd held pressure on wounds in a Baghdad hospital while bullets came through windows. She'd made decisions with blood under her fingernails and young men dying in front of her. She'd survived being erased. One tear escaped. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "Colonel Barclay's comfort is my priority," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It dropped lower, carried more weight. "And I'll document exactly why your original order was insufficient for a patient with his injury pattern." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside. Dr. Pierce's face darkened. Not with anger, with something worse. With recognition that she'd beaten him cleanly, without raising her voice, without violating a single protocol. His control was slipping and she'd done it without giving him anything to punish her for. "We'll see about your priorities," he said. He left. Rachel was staring at Katie with an expression between gratitude and terror. Colonel Barclay's monitor was still elevated, but his eyes had found Katie's and held there the smallest acknowledgement. A warrior recognizing another warrior. 2 days later, Katie arrived at 0600 for the morning shift. The public write-up board in the nurses' station had her name displayed like a warning. Rodriguez, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Her handwriting. Her credentials. Her violation of something she hadn't violated at all. The entire day shift saw it. Nurses Katie had mentored, who'd watched her save lives with hands that moved like precision instruments, who knew exactly why she'd adjusted that medication, they saw it and looked away. One of them, David, a young man she'd trained on proper for placement when he was fresh out of nursing school, actually turned around when he saw her coming. Walked in the opposite direction. The isolation had become official now. Written. Documented. Real in the way that official things were real, in the way that hospitals dealt in official things. Katie clocked in and moved through the ICU like she was walking through Baghdad all over again, present, aware, untethered from hope that anyone would stand beside her. She checked on her patients with the same precision she'd brought to everything. Vitals. Medications. Positioning. She adjusted Barclay's pillows with her hands that had held so many broken bodies, repositioning him to optimize lung expansion, to reduce the risk of the very complication that would soon define this day. She had no idea what was about to be set in motion. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had already moved beyond public humiliation. He'd entered a new phase, the careful, calculated dismantling of her professional foundation. He'd already scheduled a meeting with the Chief of Staff. He'd already prepared a folder. He'd already begun whispering to people in positions that mattered. The game had shifted. And Katie was still playing the old one. The reassignment came through at shift change without explanation. Katie saw her name removed from Colonel Barclay's chart and replaced with Dr. Chen's initials, a first-year resident who'd frozen during a simple arterial line placement 2 weeks prior. The charge nurse, avoiding eye contact, murmured something about load balancing as Katie scanned the unit. 3 rooms away. Not a coincidence. Dr. Pierce had made sure of that, the calculated precision of a man who understood how to isolate a threat without leaving fingerprints. She didn't react. Just nodded and moved to her assigned patients, a post-op sepsis case, a stroke patient waiting for transfer, a woman recovering from emergency spinal fusion. Professional. Efficient. Everything he couldn't criticize. But muscle memory doesn't forget, and neither do the body's warnings. Something in her chest tightened as she reviewed Barclay's latest orders, his pain medication adequate now, his vitals stable. Dr. Pierce's original order had been insufficient, she'd been right about that, the kind of rightness that got you written up. She tucked that knowledge away with the faded patch under her white coat, another secret carried in linen. The night shift came alive at 2:33 a.m. with the particular electricity of the witching hours, that time when bodies decide to fail in creative ways. Katie was charting in the medication room, fluorescent lights casting everything in that institutional green-white, when she heard it, not the general background symphony of the ICU but that specific pattern. A monitor alarm. The rhythm unmistakable. Desaturation. Not a slow drift but a plummet, the kind of cliff-edge drop that meant minutes, not hours. Her body moved before her conscious mind registered the room number. Muscle memory has no protocol. She reached Barclay's room in 11 seconds. The first-year nurse was standing frozen at the monitor, and Dr. Chen, the resident assigned to overnight coverage, was staring at the waveform with the expression of someone watching a car crash they couldn't stop. Colonel Barclay's oxygen saturation read 76%. 72, the numbers dropping like a countdown. His chest heaved asymmetrically, one side barely moving while the other collapsed inward. His trachea had deviated almost an inch to the left. Textbook. Devastating. Tension pneumothorax. A lung had ruptured, air accumulating in the pleural space, compressing his heart and the remaining lung into a death spiral. He needs needle decompression now, Katie said. Not a question. Not a request. Dr. Chen's eye swung toward her, confused. You're not, I'm on this patient. I need to call. There's no time. His lung is collapsing. Katie was already moving to the supply cart, hands reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind she'd last used in a field hospital where the walls were made of sandbags and the only light came from headlamps. O2 sat is dropping past 70. He goes into cardiac arrest, we lose him. I've never performed, I haven't had the training. The paralyzed Marine's eyes were tracking now, panic flooding them as his body screamed that it couldn't breathe. Barclay's daughter had gone home 2 hours prior. There was no family witness. Just medical failure and the clock counting down. Katie prepped the site at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the anatomy with the kind of certainty that comes from having done it in the dark, in the rain, with mortar fire walking across a concrete courtyard outside a field hospital in Fallujah. The skin was cool under her fingertips. She didn't need to look at Dr. Chen to know he was still frozen. She just needed the needle. Hand me the catheter, she said, not turning her head. Her voice had dropped something like an octave. Dr. Chen moved. Finally. His hand trembled as he placed the angiocath in hers. Katie could feel his hesitation, his fear, the weight of regulatory violations and liability. She understood. She didn't care. Pain was data, and the data right now was screaming that Colonel James Barclay was for minutes from cardiac arrest. The needle went through skin with a tiny resistance that her fingers recognized as normal. 1 centimeter. 2. And then the hiss. That sound. The decompression of air that had been slowly suffocating a paralyzed man while Katie was 3 rooms away, charting, following protocol, accepting reassignment without argument. The hiss of released pressure sounded like the only honest thing in the room. Like breathing. Like survival. Barclay's oxygen saturation climbed almost immediately. 75. 80. The asymmetry of his chest began to resolve, the deviated trachea drifting back to midline as his lungs re-expanded and his heart stopped being crushed. 88. 93. His eyes focused on Katie's face, and there was something there, a flicker of recognition that went deeper than ICU patient and nurse. Something that acknowledged what had just happened in the space between heartbeats. The gratitude of a man who understood how close the edge had been. The procedure took 90 seconds. Exactly. You just saved his life, Dr. Chen whispered, and his hands were shaking now, the tremor that comes from watching someone step into a situation you couldn't navigate and execute it with the precision of someone who'd practiced in situations that mattered more than a simulated scenario. Oh my God, you just document everything exactly as it happened, Katie said quietly, already stepping back. She was speaking to Dr. Chen but addressing the record. Time. Presentation. Intervention. The chain of command and the absolute clarity of what had occurred here. Note the exact presentation and the decompression technique. Needle to positive pressure release. Oxygen saturation response. All of it. Dr. Chen nodded, and she could see him mentally shifting into documentation mode, the protective reflex of a physician who understood that what had just happened would need to be legally airtight. Katie was already removing her gloves, the snap of latex against her skin sounding like punctuation. She touched the patch under her jacket without thinking, the faded unit insignia that had survived Baghdad and Kandahar and 1,000 smaller wars waged in parking lots and supply closets. The patch that knew what she was capable of. The patch that reminded her who she'd been when competence wasn't questioned because the alternative was a Marine not coming home. She moved toward the door. The first-year nurse was staring at her with an expression somewhere between awe and confusion. You weren't supposed to perform procedures outside your assignment. You weren't supposed to act like you had training you'd never documented. You weren't supposed to exist as someone who moved with that kind of certainty in a room with a paralyzed Marine whose oxygen saturation was climbing back to safe numbers. Through the glass partition, Katie saw the monitor readout stabilize. 95%. Normal. Barclay's breathing synchronized with the ventilator. His heart rate dropping from the panicked 142 where it had been spiking. Physics returning to baseline. Biology choosing to continue. A Marine who'd survived one gunshot in Baghdad had just survived something that would have killed him in this hospital if Katie hadn't been 3 rooms away and listening for the wrong kind of alarm. That was when she saw Dr. Pierce in the hallway. He'd been called by the floor supervisor. She saw him calculate that immediately in his eyes, the way he processed the scene, Barclay stable, Katie standing in the room, Dr. Chen looking grateful and terrified in equal measure. She watched Dr. Pierce survey the room with the precision of a general assessing a battlefield after someone else had already won. He didn't see a hero. Heroes weren't supposed to move with that kind of military fluidity. Heroes weren't supposed to exist in the role of a nurse who'd been publicly written up for insubordination. What he saw was a threat that had just demonstrated his own inadequacy in the starkest possible way. Everyone out except Dr. Chen, Dr. Pierce said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all suppressed power and calculated menace. Katie moved into the hallway. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Just acknowledged the command with a single nod and stepped out, letting the door swing closed behind her. But she could see through the glass partition what Dr. Pierce did next. He waited exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Katie to be far enough down the hallway that she couldn't hear him. Then he pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with surgical precision across the screen. His expression was calculating, methodical, the look of someone who understood that he was now in a new phase of engagement. The strategic phase. The phase where you didn't just isolate someone socially. You dismantled them systematically. Katie kept walking, her pace unchanged, her breathing steady, her hand steady. But she was already 3 moves ahead because she'd learned in places where being behind meant Marines didn't make it home. She'd performed a needle decompression that would be documented, witnessed by a resident who would corroborate every detail. She'd saved a patient's life in the most auditable way possible. and Dr. Pierce was about to make a phone call that would either end him or accelerate his plans to end her. The next voice she heard was the phone line connecting to the Chief of Staff, even at this hour. Even at 2:11 a.m., Dr. Pierce had the kind of authority that meant people answered. Dr. Pierce arrived 20 minutes after Katie saved Barclay's life, and he moved through the corridors with the precision of a man who had already written the narrative. The on-call resident was still shaking, still trying to document what had happened, still processing that a nurse had done what he couldn't. Dr. Pierce didn't acknowledge any of it. He went directly to the administrative wing, badge clacking against his chest like a metronome counting down someone else's career. The Chief of Staff answered on the fourth ring, voice rough with sleep. It was 3:17 a.m. Dr. Pierce. This better be. There's been a serious incident in the ICU. Code, patient decompensation, and I need to formally document a scope of practice violation before the day's shift arrives. Pierce's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, each word a brick in a wall. The nurse assigned to Colonel Barclay, Katie Rodriguez, performed an invasive needle decompression without physician supervision or authorization. Technically a life-saving intervention, yes, but she exceeded her scope significantly. Put the hospital at liability. The Chief of Staff was awake now. Pierce, if she saved. I'm requesting her immediate suspension pending investigation. I have documentation of previous judgment errors, and now this. We need to move fast. Not a question. It was the voice of a man who'd already decided, who had the institutional power to make decisions stick. I'll have formal written complaints on your desk by morning. He hung up before the Chief of Staff could object. Then Pierce made 3 more calls, to the nurse float pool manager, to the unit director, to a colleague in administration who owed him a favor from a residency letter written 8 years ago. Each conversation was surgical. Each one placed another piece on the board. By 5 a.m., Dr. Chen and the first-year resident who'd watched Katie move through the crisis like water finding its own level were being notified of unexpected reassignments. Different floors. Different units. Scattered before sunrise, separated from their testimony like witnesses being relocated. Neither of them protested, the hospital bureaucracy was too heavy, the authority too absolute. They left their shifts confused and displaced, unable to compare notes with each other, unable to corroborate what they'd seen. Dr. Pierce then accessed the duty logs from his home computer, password still cached, access still open. The electronic record of who was where at 2:11 a.m. He made one small change. Then another. The logs now showed him present in the ICU during the crisis, monitoring the situation, overseeing the intervention. A lie written in data, invisible to everyone except the few people who would have reason to check, and he was banking on no one checking, not when he'd already structured the narrative. The security guards arrived at Katie's door at 6:52 a.m. She was just finishing her night shift, the fluorescent lights of the ICU casting everything in that peculiar hospital pallor where time loses meaning. One guard was apologetic. The other was just following orders. Katie, we need you to come with us. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The way the unit director wouldn't look at her, the way the night shift nurse had stopped talking when she entered the break room, these were the tells of an institution protecting itself. She followed the guards down the corridor, past the nursing station where her name still sat on the write-up board in careful block letters. Past the ICU where her colleagues watched through the glass, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear, as if witnessing her removal might somehow contaminate them. The Chief of Staff's office was on the 4th floor. Carpeted. The kind of space designed to make you feel smaller. He sat behind his desk with Dr. Pierce standing to his right, a tableau of administrative authority. Katie, you're suspended immediately pending investigation into last night's clinical incident. The Chief of Staff didn't look at her. Dr. Pierce has documented serious concerns about your clinical judgment and scope of practice violations. Your access badge is being deactivated as of now. Katie took one measured breath. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same technique she'd used in Fallujah when IEDs came through the walls, when the world was trying to kill you and the only thing you owned was your composure. I'd like to see the documentation. You'll receive it through your attorney. Not a request. Not up for discussion. My personal belongings will be collected and mailed to your address. You need to leave the premises now. The security escort back through the hospital was designed to humiliate. They walked her past the ICU, past the nursing station, through the main corridor where the morning shift was arriving, where people stopped and stared, where rumors would start before her name was even entered into the system. She kept her spine straight. She didn't accelerate her pace. She wiped one tear away with the back of her hand as she reached the exit, a single moment of moisture that she controlled and released, the way someone lets air out of a balloon they've decided to surrender. The parking lot was empty. Her car sat where she'd left it 12 hours ago, before everything had changed, before the world had decided it was more important to protect a man's ego than acknowledge her competence. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 5 minutes before she drove home, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing even, everything about her exterior calm except for the one tremor in her chest that she would not let anyone see. But that wasn't the worst part. At home by 10:15 a.m., still in her scrubs, Katie sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she couldn't taste. The light coming through the window was the kind that made everything look ordinary, the placemats they'd bought 2 years ago, the fruit bowl with 3 bananas starting to brown, the photographs on the refrigerator of a normal life. Miguel was supposed to be at school. He wasn't. He came downstairs at 10:13, already dressed for the day, carrying his backpack. He saw her sitting there in hospital scrubs at a time when she should have been sleeping, and he stopped. 14 years old and old enough to read a situation with terrible clarity. Mom? Why are you home? Katie looked at her son, Miguel, who had his father's eyes and her jaw, who didn't know that his mother had once led medical teams through sniper fire, who'd spent his entire life believing his mother pushed wheelchairs and documented blood pressure readings and did the things ordinary nurses do. She opened her mouth to explain the situation in a way a 14-year-old could understand, but the words wouldn't come. She was the woman who had survived Fallujah, who had held the femoral artery of a Marine while helicopter rotors shook the walls, who had made decisions in blood and chaos that saved lives. And she sat at her own kitchen table and cried because a man with less competence and more credentials had written her out of her own story. Miguel didn't go to school. He went to his closet, climbed up to the back corner where his mother had never looked, and pulled down the show box. The one he'd found when he was 7 years old, the one marked in faded ink on the bottom, destroy per NSA 847B. His mother thought he didn't know about it. But he'd seen it once, opened it once, and never told her, understanding in the way children understand that some things are too big to speak out loud. The silence in the house stretched like fog. Katie still sat at the table. Miguel stood at the kitchen entrance, holding the box, understanding that whatever was in it was the reason his mother was crying, and that someone at Cedar Creek Medical had just made a choice about who got to be remembered and who got to be erased. The next morning would change everything. But first, there was only this: a woman who'd saved a soldier's life being destroyed by a man who couldn't live with the fact that someone without his status had proven more valuable than he ever could be. And a 14-year-old boy, holding evidence of who his mother actually was, preparing to walk into a hospital and remind the people who'd just tried to erase her that some people don't stay disappeared. Miguel Rodriguez pushed through the security doors of Cedar Creek Medical at 7:56 a.m. carrying a showbox the color of old bone. The security guard barely looked up. Nobody expected a 16-year-old in a school uniform to be anyone important. That was Miguel's advantage. He didn't stop at the desk. He walked past the waiting room, past the reception station, straight toward the ICU where the morning briefing was already underway. His heart hammered like rotor blades, steady and purposeful. The showbox felt heavier than it should have been, not from weight, but from what it contained. Everything his mother had been ordered to forget. Everything that proved she'd never stop being who she was. The elevator chimed. 3rd floor. The ICU corridor stretched ahead, fluorescent lights casting that sickly institutional glow that made everything look either sterile or damned. Miguel had been here twice before visiting his mom during her shifts. He knew where the board meeting would be. Conference room 3C, just past the nurse's station. The door was open. Inside, 7 people sat around a polished table: the hospital board, the chief of staff, the chief nursing officer, 2 lawyers, and Dr. Marcus Pierce. All of them with the look of people making decisions about something they didn't understand. Miguel didn't knock. He walked straight in, and the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You need to see these," he said, his voice steady. He was his mother's son. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped forward and spilled the contents of the showbox across the middle of the conference table. The medals caught the light like captured stars. A bronze star, its ribbon a muted combination of colors nobody without context could read. A silver star, the ribbon brighter, heavier with meaning. 2 purple hearts with their distinctly recognizable design. And beneath them all, the distinctive cross and anchor emblem of the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States military, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. For a moment, nobody moved. The room held its breath like a patient waiting for a diagnosis. Then the conference room door opened again. Colonel James Barkley rolled into the room in his wheelchair, his upper body moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to live with what he'd lost. His daughter Rachel pushed him, her hand on the back of the chair. Barkley's eyes found the medals immediately, and his weathered face went very still. His jaw worked silently for 2 seconds, then a single word escaped: Reaper 6. The room erupted into crosstalk. The lawyers leaned forward. The chief of staff's face went pale. But Rachel had already picked up the citation card that accompanied the Navy Cross, her hands trembling as she read aloud. Her voice cracked on every other word. For conspicuous gallantism during Operation Phantom Fury, Captain Rodriguez led her medical team under direct fire to extract 17 wounded Marines from hostile territory in Fallujah. Despite 3 separate casualties among her team and continuous enemy fire from multiple positions, Captain Rodriguez remained in the field, treating injuries and coordinating evacuation. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of all extracted personnel. Captain Rodriguez's service reflects extraordinary courage and dedication to her unit. 17 wounded Marines. 3 of her own team killed. Enemy fire. Fallujah. The words hung in the air like the smell of antiseptic that never quite left a hospital, present in everything, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Dr. Pierce's face had shifted from confusion to something uglier. Calculation. "This is a fabrication," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "There is no Captain Katie Rodriguez in any military database I can access. These medals could be purchased online. This is a fraud, plain and simple. Someone here is running an elaborate hoax to manipulate this committee's decision." "You're right," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. 2 men in dress blue stood in the threshold. One was a Marine general, his uniform a landscape of decorations that made the civilians in the room look like they wore pajamas. The other was an older man in a Navy service dress, his bearing suggesting authority from an organization nobody mentioned in polite company. The general stepped forward, his boots striking the linoleum with a sound like a judge's gavel, and rendered a perfect salute to the medals on the table. Not to the people in the room. To the decorations themselves. To what they represented. "Captain Rodriguez saved my Marines," the general said quietly. His voice sounded like it had been trained to give orders to people whose lives depended on hearing those orders correctly. "I know exactly who she is." The Navy officer stepped toward the table and opened a leather folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room had already stopped breathing. Captain Rodriguez's military records are classified under National Security Directive 847-B. Her operational history is sealed. Her deployment locations are redacted. Her unit designation is classified. What is not classified is this: this hospital just fired a holder of the Navy Cross based on the false testimony of a man whose medical credentials are now under federal review. You terminated a decorated combat veteran for performing an emergency medical procedure that saved Colonel James Barkley's life. Twice. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The pink drained from his face like someone had turned off a valve. His hands, which had trembled with rage for weeks, now trembled with something else. Terror. Furthermore, the Navy officer continued, FBI investigators examined your documentation regarding Captain Rodriguez's suspension. The timestamps on your files don't match the system metadata. The duty logs show evidence of post-incident alteration. Your colleague on the credentialing committee has produced emails in which you explicitly requested he adjust some paperwork to correct errors. When combined with your documented interference in a federal military matter, you're looking at obstruction of justice and falsification of federal documents. The words fell like dominoes. Obstruction. Falsification. Federal. The words that turned a powerful man into a defendant. The investigation that followed moved with bureaucratic brutality. The Pentagon liaison requested all documentation within 2 hours. Dr. Chen was brought back from the reassigned floor and gave a statement identifying Katie as the sole person who saved Barkley's life. The first-year resident corroborated, admitting Pierce had explicitly told her to forget the details of who did what. Security footage from the ICU showed the real timeline, no Dr. Pierce until 23 minutes after Katie performed the needle decompression. His absence was documented. His absence was irrefutable. The credentialing committee review revealed the post-incident alterations. Metadata timestamps proved files had been modified hours after the crisis. The FBI got involved when the Pentagon liaison flagged potential falsification of federal documents. They subpoenaed communications. 3 a.m. phone calls to the Chief of Staff. Messages coordinating witness reassignment. Edited duty logs. Everything. The local news picked it up within 48 hours, Navy Cross recipient fired after saving Marine's life. Raleigh's evening broadcast led with the perp walk, Dr. Marcus Pierce in handcuffs, escorted from Cedar Creek Medical, his face the color of old bone. Federal charges. Obstruction of justice. Falsifying medical records. Interference with a federal investigation. His medical license suspended pending criminal trial. The hospital, desperate to avoid federal scrutiny and civil lawsuits, moved quickly. Katie received a full reinstatement offer with back pay, a public apology, and something more, a new position. Director of Emergency Medicine. A role created specifically to rebuild the department's reputation. The unit director who enabled Pierce was demoted. The Chief of Staff quietly retired. Pierce taught CPR certification at a community college in a strip mall classroom, working minimum wage. Every time he stood in front of those bored students demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his hands remembered when they held real authority. Now they held nothing but the weight of his own choices. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez walked into Cedar Creek Medical in a white coat bearing her new title. Her first stop was room 347. Colonel Barkley was completing his final physical therapy session, his hands stronger now, his grip like iron when he shook Katie's hand from his wheelchair. Rachel hugged her without hesitation. "He's going home because of you," she said. "Twice now." "The honor was mine, Colonel," Katie said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. Back at her new office, she removed the faded unit patch from inside her white coat lining, the ghost she'd carried for 14 years, the proof that she'd never stopped being who she was. She framed it on her wall next to her Navy Cross, finally allowed to remember who she'd always been. When she touched the glass, her reflection superimposed over the Fallujah designation. In the glass, she looked whole. That evening, she met Miguel for dinner. Both in uniform. His marine dress blues, her hospital whites. Outside, Raleigh traffic hummed past the restaurant window. Inside, a mother and son who both knew exactly what it meant to serve shared a meal in the kind of quiet that only comes after surviving the worst and choosing to help others do the same. The patch that connected their stories rested on her office wall where it belonged. Where it had always belonged. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Because we know exactly what's at stake when someone needs saving, and we'll never stop fighting, even when they take our names away. If this story moved you, subscribe now. Like this video. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you actually were?